Hi, friends, and welcome to the 1840 podcast, where each month we explore a different topic balancing modern sensibilities with traditional sensitivities to give you new approaches to timeless Jewish ideas. I'm your host, David Beshefkin, and this month we're continuing our exploration of Chabad and the philosophy of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. This podcast is part of a larger exploration of those big, juicy Jewish ideas. So be sure to check out 1840.org, where you can also find videos, articles, recommended readings, and weekly emails. I am so excited for our guest today, who has actually been on 1840 before. He is a very close friend. I know I say that a lot. It's like a running joke, but he really is one of my dearest friends. We studied Torah together. We learned Kesubos, I think, briefly together. Maybe I'm totally wrong on that. I'm wrong on that. I don't think we learned together, but I think I learned in his spot, like in his seat in the Beis Midrash. He had this beautiful corner seat in the Beis Midrash, but we used to always talk together in Torah learning. And that, of course, is my dearest friend, Rabbi Dr. Yosef Bronstein, who is really an incredible person. We had him on last time to talk about the philosophy of Rav Kook in that series on the origins of Judaism, which you can go check out. That was an absolutely fascinating series. And we're talking now about the philosophy of the Lubavitcher Rebbe and Chabad. And I just want to explain a little bit, like, why are we talking about this? Why are we talking about so much about the philosophy of Chabad? Am I trying on 1840 to convert people to Chabad? Am I trying to get people to become or contribute to Chabad? That, of course, is not the case, though you're welcome to either adopt a Chabad ideology, or if you are interested, of course, you are more than welcome to donate and sponsor Chabad's work. The reason why I think this is so important is because most Jews, I would say nearly all Jews, and I would assume all of our listeners, have interacted with Chabad. Chabad is associated, particularly in the Orthodox community, as the place you go when you need food on vacation. It is the movement that you see putting tefillin on random strangers on the street, and when they ask you, and assuming that people within the Orthodox community have put on tefillin, that, you get to say, oh, no, I already have it on, and they, sometimes don't even ask people who look Orthodox, assuming that they have already put on tefillin. And my guess is that an Orthodox Jew who doesn't put on tefillin, Orthodox Jewish male, because tefillin is only worn by men, at least within the Orthodox community. But my guess is that if somebody did not put on tefillin and is presenting as Orthodox, they were stopped by Chabad. My guess is most yeshiva grads, and I'm sure there are people who miss tefillin, would probably be too embarrassed to even say anything. So we don't look at that as an initiative, as so to speak, for us. And by us, I'm talking to those raised within the Orthodox community. And what I really am trying to do in this series is try to put some substance and depth to the movement that we are already familiar with, to kind of step away from a more surface reading of what Chabad is and what Chabad represents, and to understand that there is a very rich, sophisticated philosophy behind this movement that I think is especially necessary for the modern Orthodox community. It is especially necessary for those who were traditionally educated in yeshiva to step into and to better understand. Why do I say that? I think in this moment, and I shared this online, and you can correct me if I am wrong, I was going back and thinking about how the traditional Jewish community responded after the 6-Day War. There was this miraculous 6-Day War, and there was an upswelling, an absolute upswelling of people who were searching for religious meaning, who were searching for traditional Jewish life. Rav Wolbe, who is a famous rabbi in Israel, who wrote a lot of works on theology and direction in Jewish life. I don't even know how to describe his works. It'd probably be called like almost hashkafa, which is like your religious outlook. He wrote a book responding to the upswelling of the outreach movement that really was championed by many within the non-Chabad traditional Orthodox community. And what I have noticed, and you could argue maybe I'm overly dramatizing this upswelling of what happened after the Six-Day War. I was not alive, but it's something I've read about. It's seen, and people who really know the history of the outreach movement know, I think the movements of Eish HaTorah and Or Sameach, like they really blew up during this time. And I was thinking now of what I have seen and noticed within the traditional Orthodox non-Chabad community. I have noticed that I have not seen that type of mobilization of reintroducing the wider Jewish community, the global Jewish community, particularly the American Jewish community, and really taking this moment seriously and meeting this moment. Now, you could argue and say in this moment, there really isn't such an upswelling. You know, October 7th was so painful and so difficult. The Six-Day War was a miraculous victory, and it didn't really lead to that upswelling. I think you're absolutely wrong. I think if you open your eyes, you will see, particularly because of what has happened on campus and just being in the headlines every day, Jews, non-Orthodox Jews who never got a yeshiva education are feeling this intense connection to their Jewish identity. They're asking questions about Jewish life. And so much else, so much of the infrastructure in the non-Orthodox community is starting to erode or collapse entirely if you're paying attention to this. And what I've kind of noticed, and I'm frustrated by it, I'm deeply frustrated by it, is that I do not see any sort of mobilization within the Orthodox community to kind of reintroduce, or at least lead some sort of movement to reintroduce American Jewry to traditional Jewish life. I am not suggesting that we need more of the Kiruv movement. That's the paradigm that we usually use. I'm talking about the reintroduction of just basic common Judaism to the masses, to almost share what the Orthodox community has learned with the wider American Jewish community. We have learned a great deal of how to sustain community, how to build community. And I'm just wondering, why in our community are we not mobilizing like that? Particularly I'm talking specifically about the American Jewish community and specifically about the American Orthodox community. And I wonder if that is because our sense of responsibility to the wider Jewish community has eroded. I wonder if it relates to our own insecurity about even imagining a type of Judaism that could reach the wider Jewish community. Or maybe you might suggest a much more simplistic answer. And that is, well, we already have the infrastructure of the outreach movement. Send them to Aish.com, send them to some other website that is really more focused on introductory Judaism stuff. I don't think that's sufficient. I don't think that's meeting this moment. And I don't think as a community we are really reflecting and meeting the opportunity and the magnitude of this awakening that we are seeing throughout the world. And particularly in the United States. In Israel, this is in the air. And I far be it from me to even step into that and suggest what that should be. But I do believe that there's so much opportunity in this moment. And I am most curious, and I could be wrong. Maybe the upswelling is not really there. Maybe I'm overly romanticizing what happened after the Six-Day War. But I'm not sure that that's the answer. And I think that maybe a part of the answer is that we, as a community, and when I say we, I don't mean if you are fully Orthodox. I don't mean that you went to the Yeshiva League. I mean people who are really thinking about these issues. I think we need to re-engage and re-examine the very philosophy on which we build our Jewish lives. And one of the people who I think had a vision for worldwide Jewry, a vision for what it would even look like to activate and actualize traditional Jewish life, to take Judaism seriously, to imagine for a moment that there really was a God and a covenant with a specific people, to follow these laws of God and live a certain way, to really subsume that reality in your life, and to really confront the existential questions that I believe October 7th have raised for our community. I think that the philosophy and the person that is a great starting point to reflect on our community is none other than the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And I can think of nobody better to explain his philosophy to a non-Hasidic community than my dearest friend, Yosef Bronstein. Yosef Bronstein, I love talking and I love praising him because I think he is a model for the type of deeply committed, passionate Yiddishkeit, passionate Judaism, but he's very almost plain and regular, deeply regular. He went to MTA, he went to YU, he went to KBY, he also went to the Gush. I think he switched out of KBY, and he went through a very traditional upbringing, and there was a part of him, and he even was involved on the highest levels of traditional Talmud scholarship, that Torah that would be learned at any yeshiva anywhere. He learns at the very, very highest level. He put out, as I mentioned in my introduction, later, he put out the classes, the shiurim, as they're known, of Rabbi Soloveitchik on Kiddushin. He wrote that entire work. He's really an incredible person. But more than that, his character is simply inspiring. I want to tell you something. After my interview with Yosef Bronstein, he sent me a WhatsApp message. It is remarkable what this WhatsApp message said. I want to share it with you because aside from the fact that he asked me to make sure that this is included, I don't think he needed me to read the exact message, but it's a testament to his character and to his decency. This is what he wrote. He said, "Good morning, David. I hope all is well. Thank you so much for inviting me back to 1840. It really means a lot. As you could probably tell, I don't relish recorded interviews, but I know that I'm in good hands with you leading the conversation. If the interview is a written piece, I'd like to fine-tune a ton of things. That's fine, okay. But here's the real thing, and I want to read it to you because this is a testament not only to his character, but shows what's on his mind after an interview. But there was one brief segment that I would kindly ask you to replace, please, if possible. In the rapid-fire questions, you asked for other books. I had prepared for this and meant to use it as a platform to mention how much I gained from reading other books, both Chabad and academic, and highlight the writings of Rav Yoel Kahn, Eli Rubin, and Elliot Wilson. In the end, I froze and couldn't get the answer out properly. I feel deep indebtedness to them and really wanted to be more filled with praise for these three in particular, and to be clear that my work rests on the amazing, groundbreaking work of others." That is a special person. He is writing this because our entire interview is about his forthcoming book published by Koren, which is called Engaging the Essence, the Torah Philosophy of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. It is out now. It is an amazing, astounding work. And really, I know this from inside Chabad circles, there is not an English work, a one-volume English work that really takes you through the philosophy of the Lubavitcher Rebbe like this work. And I have exciting news for 1840 listeners. Sign up for our emails and we will be sending out a code where you will be able to get 10% off. 10% off, not just of this book, but any Koren order. But I would ask that you sign up. We send out emails every single week. We are going to include the code in the email. It is good for all Koren orders until August 31st. And I would please ask you to please sign up for our emails. We're going to send it out this week. The coupon code that you'll get 10%, not off just on the book, but on an entire Koren order. And I am just so grateful, not only to our partners in Koren, but to my dearest friend Yosef Bronstein. This is an amazing work, and I am so grateful for this interview because I think in this moment, Chabad, as important as their work is, for when we vacation, when we need food, the philosophy of the Rebbe, at least engaging with it, thinking about it to help meet this moment and imagine a world where Judaism was taken seriously, where Yiddishkeit really had something that could offer the entire world. It is my absolute privilege and pleasure to introduce our conversation with my dearest friend, Yosef Bronstein. I am so excited to reintroduce a past guest, somebody who I consider a dear friend and somebody who I really consider in many ways a mentor, Rabbi Dr. Yosef Bronstein. It is an absolute privilege and pleasure to welcome you back to 1840.
Rav David, it is an honor to be back. Thank you. I really appreciate the second time invitation.
So we had a conversation a while back related to the philosophy of Rav Kook, specifically in our series on the origins of Judaism and the development of the oral law. It was a fascinating conversation for people who want to take a look at that. It also made a lot more sense why we were having that conversation. I've known you for a very long time. You were a pillar in the Yeshiva University base Midrash. Just looking at the way that you present yourself, as you have a kippah sruga on. You were always involved in the Torah of Rabbi Soloveitchik. You put out Rabbi Soloveitchik shiurim on Kiddushin recently, a rabbinic work. And now, all of a sudden, my old friend, Yosef Bronstein, has come out with a new work called Engaging the Essence, the Torah Philosophy of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And my opening question is, Yosef Bronstein, what happened to you? You were involved in the Torah of Rav Kook. That itself was a departure from the more Litvak, non-Hasidic, non-theological, non-mystical Yosef Bronstein that I thought I knew and loved, somebody who was immersed in the what we call the Havayas of Abaya and Rava, the classical Talmudic approach, and you got more involved in kind of more mystical approaches through Rav Kook. But why the Lubavitcher Rebbe? In many ways, it seems like we have Chabad who could share the Torah of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. What drew you specifically to his Torah?
Wow, that is a fascinating question. I hope you can still know and love me, even when my mystical side is more out.
Perhaps I know and love you even more now.
Wow.
I'm exaggerating some of my surprise, obviously, because I always thought I knew you really, really well. So this actually doesn't surprise me all that much. But explain, a more plain reading of Yosef Bronstein. This would come as a surprise. So explain to our audience what drew you to his Torah.
So this story really begins with my interest in Rav Kook. Growing up, I knew about the Lubavitcher Rebbe just as somebody from the outside knows about the Lubavitcher Rebbe. He's a great leader. He inspired an amazing religious revival. He inspired a social movement. When you go to the Bronx Zoo in Chol Hamoed, you have people asking you if you shook Dalamidim on your way out. And I really didn't know about the Lubavitcher Rebbe as a religious thinker, as a Talmud Chacham, as a great Torah scholar. My interest in the world of Jewish thought in general started with Rav Kook, and when I was in Yeshiva in Eretz Israel, where I have the privilege to be right now, in Eretz Israel, that sparked my interest in Jewish philosophy, in Machshava, particularly in the mystical thought. And then when I went back to Yeshiva University, I started studying these things from a more academic perspective. And when you're taking academic courses on Jewish philosophical thought, you're not just studying a figure, you're studying a whole chain. You're looking for influences, looking for antecedents, you're looking for the intellectual history. What is unique about Rav Kook, such that he took a lot of earlier sources and he did something amazing with them. So that led me to Tanya, because Rav Kook himself says, he told a few of his students that Tanya was a major influence on his own thought, even though Rav Kook hardly quotes any sources, but he identified Tanya as a major influence on his own thought. And I realized Tanya was an amazingly important work within the world of Hasidus. I really had very little background in Hasidus in general. And I got myself a Chavrusa in Tanya. I went through Tanya twice in the YU-based Midrash with full-blown YU-based Midrash people. It was a great experience. Rav Steinsaltz's Perush was a huge help. Some of the English
his
translations, his commentary. Sorry, yes, not just his translation. His commentary was a huge help. Some of the translations and commentaries in Chabad.org were also huge helps. Lessons in Tanya, in particular, that was my first foray into Chabad.org. And then through that, I used to go back and forth between the Beis Federation and the YU Library, and I realized there was a whole shelf in the YU Library about Tanya and about Chabad Hasidus. I started reading things about Tanya, both from later Chabad Hasidim and from academics. And then the next thing over on the shelf were books of and books about the Lubavitcher Rebbe. So being a curious person with probably a little bit too much time on my hands, I started taking the books off the shelf and reading them. I started looking at articles in Chabad.org. And I realized slowly that the Lubavitcher Rebbe wasn't just an amazing spiritual leader who led a social movement. He was an amazing Jewish philosopher, a Jewish mystic. He was a huge Torah scholar who had innovative and fascinating things to say about every topic in Judaism, both totally theoretical and abstract, and very, very practical. And all these different elements really came together to create a holistic worldview that he taught over the course of the 40 years of his leadership. And that's slowly...
Let me push back a little bit before you get to the book and this. There must have been something missing specifically in your modern Orthodox upbringing, which I want to try to get to, that drew you specifically to the Torah of the Rebbe. Meaning, I also hung out in the YU library. There are a lot of fascinating individuals whose shelves are replete with secondary literature. I could have imagined an alternative history where you stumbled upon a shelf of academic works on Rabbi Soloveitchik. You could have done academic works on the Satmar Rav. You could have done academic works on the Maharal. There are a lot of people to choose from. I understand what drew you to Rav Kook, because your modern Orthodox upbringing and being, identifying as a religious Zionist, Rav Kook is seen as the kind of the mystical expression of our more non-mystical community, right? Like, he discusses a lot of the ideas that we grapple with, whether what we call in the Yeshiva University community Torah Umada, the role of secular studies, the role of work, the role of sports, the role of the state of Israel. Rav Kook addresses a lot of this. But the Lubavitcher Rebbe, I would not, I wouldn't put him in that box. I wouldn't say there is an immediate connection. You could always find connections with different thinkers. What did you feel was missing? What was the question or the absence that you were grappling with that pulled you so deeply into the world of the Chabad and specifically the Rebbe?
It's a great question, and I would push back on a couple of points. Number one, I feel like there's a lot more in common between Rav Kook and the Lubavitcher Rebbe than maybe perhaps perhaps your average modern Orthodox upbringing and Rav Kook and the Lubavitcher Rebbe. They're both coming from a world of Jewish mysticism. They both have certain core ideas that resonated with me very deeply. And I think a lot of the ideas that drew me to Rav Kook eventually drew me to the Lubavitcher Rebbe as well, with certain additions and a particular flavor. So I outlined some of the ideas that resonated with me very, very deeply. I wouldn't say I had a burning question or a hole in my religiosity that I was trying to fill. These were slow, organic processes that I slowly got into a worldview. I found it fascinating intellectually in terms of what a person was doing with the Makoros, and some of the key ideas resonated with me very deeply. And then slowly, over the course of years of learning it, I feel like it has had a tremendous impact on the way I view myself, my life, and my relationship with the Kadosh Baruch Hu and Adam Yisrael. So do you want to go through some of the key ideas?
We'll get to that in a moment. Before we get to the key ideas, I was wondering, do you remember the first time that you read Torah from the Rebbe, or the first time you read a Torah that, like, your eyes opened up? Like, when you form a serious connection, I know this with myself, it's no surprise, I have always felt connected with the Torah of Rav Tzadok. And I can remember both the first time I heard something quoted in the name of Rav Tzadok and the first time I saw Torah in the name of Rav Tzadok. Again, Rav Tzadok was a Hasidic thinker, for our listeners who don't know, who lived from 1823 to 1900. But I remember the first time, I read something that was like, wow, he is addressing the things I want to know more about. Do you have memories like that with the Torah of the Rebbe?
I don't. I don't have a single punctuated moment where I became a chassid in a certain sense of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. it was a slow and gradual process. I was familiar with some of the ideas in Chabad, I was familiar with some of the parallel ideas in the thought of Rav Kook, and I just saw somebody who was putting it together in a extremely well-sourced and extremely innovative, holistic, and fascinating way. There were certain books that I read. Rabbi Faisal Levin is, I think, a shliach in Australia. He has a sefer, a book in English, which was free online at Chabad.org, which is called, I'm forgetting exactly what it's called, The Theology of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. It's not chock full with sources, but it sort of outlines some of the major theological innovations, so to speak, of the Lubavitcher Rebbe and puts it together very nicely. So I had like a substructure in my mind as I was reading through individual pieces, and then things just fell together, and I realized I was on a gold mine of for me personally, something that was intellectually fascinating and spiritually very, very meaningful.
So we're going to get to, obviously, what most people associate philosophically with the Rebbe is the notion of Mashiach, messianism. I want to hold off on that. We'll come back to it. Before we get to the question of messianism, Mashiach, and all of the polemics that have kind of come up around that idea, I want to actually begin. I love the way you're expressing it, the innovations, the theological innovations of the Rebbe. A lot of times people see people who run traditional social movements as not being theologically innovative. Theological innovation, we usually affiliate with people who are kind of on the margins of tradition, who are coming up against tradition, who are reformulating tradition. Why do you describe the Rebbe, and what was it about his philosophy that you describe as theologically innovative?
So this is a great question, and I have to be careful because I think the final formulations of the Lubavitcher Rebbe are innovative, and especially the way he puts different earlier ideas of Hasidus together to create a unified worldview is innovative. But any particular sikha is going to have upwards of 100 makoros. Any maimar, which is a more in-depth Hasidic discourse, also have hundreds and hundreds of sources that he's working with. So that was one of the things that was fascinating for me about the Lubavitcher Rebbe. I was coming from the world of Gemara, where everything is source-based, Rav Kook, where things are much more poetic. Then you have the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who's articulating a very spiritually meaningful, intellectually fascinating philosophy, but everything is also extremely source-based, but he's putting the sources together and reading them in such a way that you end up with extremely interesting formulations. So the innovativeness is there, but he's clearly based on an earlier tradition, and I think that was part of the way that was part of his self-identity. That was the way he viewed himself, as putting together different strands of earlier Hasidus to come up with something whole, complete, and concrete. In terms of what some of the ideas are, so just to mention one. So again, this has many antecedents in earlier Hasidus, and I'm sure my Chabad friends are going to tell me that I'm overemphasizing the chidush, the innovation of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. But there's an idea which I don't know how abstract or philosophical you want to get over here. But there's
as long as you translate, I don't have a problem. But if you're using mystical terminology, try to translate as best as you can.
Fantastic. So if you read, let's start with the Bible. Let's start with Tanakh. If you read Tanakh, there's God, and then there's the world. God creates the world, he interacts with the world, sometimes he descends into the world, but God and the world are two distinct entities. That perspective is amplified by the Rambam, by the Maimonides, who writes that God is so distinct, so transcendent, so distant from this world, you can't even use any positive terms that exist in our lingo, in our language, in our lexicon to describe God. One of the innovations of the world of mysticism, and Hasidus in particular, is to sort of bridge this gap. And in some way that we don't fully understand, the entire world is enveloped within a divinity. Everything in the world is an expression of God. God is everywhere. God permeates everything. Fantastic. That's an idea that exists in Tanya. It's an idea that exists everywhere in Hasidus. What the Lubavitcher Rebbe did was to emphasize that this is not just that the physical world also could be a conduit towards divinity, that it's actually particularly the physical world, the engaging with physicality, engaging with people that don't necessarily seem so transcendent, getting your hands dirty with the nitty-gritty aspects of life, that it's not that even these things could connect you to God, but he'll throw at you 100 sources, 1,000 sources, 10,000 sources, which will put together to prove to you that it's specifically through engaging in these things, through what you would call the tachtonim, the things that seem to be the lowest, that seem to be the farthest, the most distant from God, that it's specifically when engaging with those things or engaging in those places or with those ideas, that is specifically through those things which you could engage the essence, which you could sort of touch or access to whatever way we can the essence of God. And that is a philosophical truth that the Rebbe tried to prove in his abstract Hasidic discourses. And then you also see the way he concretized that in terms of creating a social movement where no person, no place, no idea, nothing about the world is beyond the grasp of divinity. And then he also, there are two things now, the abstract philosophy and the concrete social movement. You see the connection between the two. I'm cutting out the 1,000 sources he quotes just for the sake of brevity. You can read the book and get some of them at least. And then the third thing is that all of these things come together at a unique sui generis. Is that the word? A unique sui
Don't ask me pronunciation questions. Okay. That's the one area of halacha I am not good with. Latin pronunciation.
At this unique historical moment, that in earlier generations, maybe the primary way of accessing God was through abstract thought, was through Talmud Torah, was through mysticism, through what we refer to as spirituality. It's specifically as you get closer to Mashiach, as the generations go down and down and down, that our job in our generation is to demonstrate the divinity of the tachtonim, of those things that seem the most distant from God. So you have this combination of three different elements coming together to create a very, very powerful worldview, which then gets refracted and reflected and concretized in a million different ways. But you have the notion that God is everywhere and God is everything. You have the notion that it's specifically through the tachtonim, through the things that seem the farthest, where you could access God the most. You have a social movement or a religious movement the Rebbe created to engage everything in the world. And the Rebbe is emphasizing that it's particularly this generation that we have to sort of shift the texture of our service of God to put this idea as a primary idea in our minds. So that was fascinating for me.
I could only imagine, because it is such a reformulation of the ethic of the yeshiva world, which is we are trying to preserve an insular, Torah-centric society and hoping that one day the rest of society will join us, but we're not. We're here to preserve something very unique, knowing that it could be lost, potentially. Meaning, the question that I have when you describe that, and I almost want to ask as like a modern Orthodox Jew, because you grew up in the world where synthesis and finding, you were a student, I believe, of Rav Aaron Lichtenstein. You learned by Rabbi Michael Rosenzweig, who has a PhD, another former 1840 guest. As he's known in some circles, very small circles, but in some circles, a Rosh Yeshiva in Yeshiva University. You are familiar with the world of synthesis. Rav Aaron Lichtenstein can quote, Milton, he can quote literature. Rabbi Rosenzweig, Rav Rosenzweig certainly is very well versed in history and philosophy and all sorts of other types of wisdom. How is the synthesis that the Rebbe is talking about finding divinity even outside of Torah, different than the synthesis that you must be familiar with from growing up in the world, in that ecosystem of thought within the Yeshiva University based Midrash?
So that is a great question, and I think I could have a two-pronged answer. So remind me to get back to the second prong, please, after I finish the first one.
Sure.
One prong is that coming from the world of Yeshiva University based Midrash, there is definitely an emphasis on the nitty-gritty of this world. Halachic man is all about how earlier religious thought or other religions are about transcendence.
Halachic Man is a book, correct? Halachic Man is a book written by...
It is a book written by Rabbi Soloveitchik, describing the perspective of a person who has imbibed the value system of halacha and views the world through that lens. So what Rabbi Soloveitchik describes in that book is that this type of person has the opposite religious orientation of people from other religions. Other religions are seeking transcendence, or seeking the heavens, or seeking a way out of this world. Halachic man is actually seeking a way into this world, because halakha has to be done in the here and now. So in the Yeshiva University based Midrash world, as I understood it, at least, there might be other strands, but the primary theme that I at least received from my Rebbeim is that the way to engage this world and the reason why this world is important is because it is the playing field, it is the arena through which we could keep halakha, do the mitzvos, and that is God's will, and that's it, and then that is God's will. The thing that the Lubavitcher Rebbe has a similar perspective in the sense that this world, the nitty-gritty of this world, is the major arena of connection to God. But it's not just because this is the world in which we could live out the divine will, and we could keep halacha here. You look at a tree, or as Salvation describes, you think about all the halachos that have to do with the tree. For the Lubavitcher Rebbe, it's not just halacha; it's transcendence, it's divinity. You want to develop a personal relationship with God. You want to feel close to God, whatever that means. You want to engage the essence. You have to engage the tree, and God gives you ways to engage the tree. There is a halachos about it. And there are mitzvos, and mitzvos are very, very important. But sort of like the whole narrative behind why mitzvos are important and why living out the divine will in this world is important. That is something which I feel like the Lubavitch perspective sort of fills in that background information, as opposed to just focusing on the nitty gritty of halacha. That I think is one major difference. And if you look at Rav Bronstein's essays about why reading English literature is important, a lot of it has to do with, he quotes from the Rambam. The Rambam says that he says it makes a person more sensitive. It could help build a person's midos. And then he starts speaking about how, the same way the Rambam describes, if you appreciate the world of science, then you will understand more, you will appreciate the greatness of God's mind, so to speak, and that will lead you to more love of God and fear of God. The same thing is true about English literature. You could marvel at the great creative minds of human beings and think, who created this? It was God that ultimately created the human mind. So Rabbi Bronstein is appreciating the English literature, appreciating things in this world, but I feel like it's very much through a halachic lens. The Lubavitcher Rebbe, halacha is obviously very, very important. It was always important in Chabad, perhaps even more than in other strands of Hasidus, and we could discuss why if you would like. I'm going to get there
in a second.
But there is a heavy emphasis on God, on divinity, and with creating a whole background narrative, a background structure as to why these things are important. That is reason number one. That's prong one. Prong two is also a narrative, but a narrative along a historical axis. If you read Rav Soloveitchik's Halachic Man, there is a little bit about Jewish history there, about history of the world, but it's a little bit tucked away in the beginning of section 2. Halachic Man is really about the here and now. I want to fulfill God's will in this world. How do I go ahead and do that? Well, I think what Chabad and Hasidus and Rav Kook and this entire world of Jewish mysticism gives you, so to speak, or what it adds, is their historical narrative that God created the story you get if you read Tanakh. God created the world at a certain point. That's the beginning. And then there's an end game. There's something called Geula, redemption, Mashiach, whatever you want to call it. That's the end point. And we're somewhere along the timeline. And it's our job through Torah mitzvos to engaging this world to slowly move the ball closer and closer and closer towards that ultimate messianic time, towards a true, a complete redemption, as the Lubavitcher Rebbe always used to refer to it as. So there's much more meaning in terms of the Torah mitzvos you're doing. There's much more to think about in terms of what aspects of Torah mitzvahs you're going to emphasizing. How do I make decisions in my life? It's not just I open up Shulchan Aruch and I see. It's I want to bring the world towards Geula. I want to fulfill the words of the Nevi'im. I want Tanya Parak Lamed Vav to be fulfilled. How do I do that? What are the steps necessary to take you there? And I think that engaging the world with that type of mindset definitely changes the texture of it, and it definitely changes the meaning of it. And this is something the Lubavitcher Rebbe shares with Rav Kook. Rav Kook also has this type of narrative perspective. We're here, we're getting close to Geula. What do we need to do in order to push ourselves closer and closer to the finish line?
One thing that unites the Lubavitcher Rebbe and Rav Kook is the way that their philosophy looks at secular Jews, or Jews who are not a part of the traditional, what we may call nowadays the Orthodox community, and having a maybe more optimistic or more nuanced approach for what is the end game, so to speak, for such people. In the Orthodox community, and you could correct me if I am wrong, but we grew up in fairly similar worlds. I believe did we go to the same elementary school? Are you a South Shore boy?
I am a South Shore boy, yes.
Okay, we went to the same elementary school, different high schools, but In the Orthodox community, I kind of grew up where, we're the traditional community. We're the ones who have it, so to speak. I'm using air quotes. I don't want to offend any of our listeners. We have it right. And the goal is for the rest of the Jewish community to, so to speak, become Orthodox as the way that we understand it. Like, I don't know, like growing up, I said, when Mashiach comes, I don't know, everybody's going to move to Woodmere or Beit Shemesh, if you're a religious Zionist, or Lakewood if you're yeshivish. And you kind of have this vision, which I always struggled with because just sociologically, it seems fantastical in a lot of ways. It's much harder to imagine, as opposed to Rav Kook and the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who I think developed a much richer theology for the current makeup of our community, for why there's such a tiny minority who actually is engaged, and what exactly is the purpose or the spiritual value of the rest of our community. I am curious how you understood and approached the Lubavitcher Rebbe's vision or his understanding of the widespread secularism in the Jewish community, and what should our vision be? People who believe in the divinity of Torah and mitzvos, what should our vision be? Is our goal to make sure everyone puts on tefillin once? Is our goal to, is it the Kiruv movement? Is it to get everybody to Eish HaTorah? It seems that there's something about the philosophy of the Rebbe that had him stand apart both from the Orthodox community's vision of itself and the Kiruv community's vision of the non-observant community. How would you articulate the Lubavitcher Rebbe's vision for the Jewish community and contrasting it to other communities?
Well, that is a great question. I think it has multiple aspects. I think the first question you're asking was, is there a narrative as to why the majority of Jews are secular today, or meaning are not halakhically observant? So as far as I'm aware, as far as it's coming to me right now, I don't think the Lubavitcher Rebbe spends a lot of time describing why that religious shift took place. Rav Kook does, as I'm sure you're aware. He has essays and essays and explanations as to what the major shift was, which for Rav Kook was a major. You have to know the source of the religious change in order to know the solution, or to know where to go from here. But if I recall correctly, the Rebbe does not have a lot of passages describing the reason behind the widespread secularism. But the Rebbe does have a lot of passages describing the value of Jews and the value of Am Yisrael. And the Rebbe's, I think the starting point is that is like, I guess I would say like this, in two levels. Number one is each Jew as an individual Jew, it has an inextricable relationship with God. That there is neshama Elokah mimal mamish, as Tanya says, Elokah mimal mamish within each individual Jew, and that pintaliyah, that yechida shebenefesh, as the Rebbe referred to it, is something that is immutable. It is always going to be there. So you don't have the notion, like, Rav Tzadok quotes from the Rashba, perhaps there's a Machlokas Tanaim, and maybe you could have Jews who lose their Kedushas Yisrael, Jews who lose their sanctity, to be totally severed. That cannot exist. There is an immutable slice of God, whatever term you want to use, within each and every Jew. And that makes you, when you think about another Jew, when you relate to another Jew, you have to realize that deep down, you are relating to a slice of divinity, to one of the deepest expressions of divinity in this world. That, I would say, is perspective A. Perspective B is that not with each individual Jew and their relationship to God, it's that Jews' relationship to each other. Because God is one, and because there is a piece of divinity, a slice of divinity, whatever English term you want to use over here, is never going to be sufficient within me and within you and within a Jew that is not halakhically observant. And we know that God is one. That means that in some deep level, all of our neshamos are united, not in the sense of a composite of they're bringing different elements together. They're really the same exact element shining through in different ways. And that obviously also is going to create a different type of relationship with another Jew. If A, you believe that when you're speaking to another Jew, you are speaking to a slice of divinity, and number two, you're speaking to a slice of yourself. And then, upon those two bases, upon that foundation, there is a notion. The Rebbe says that, and the Rebbe said that Avas Yisrael flows from Achdus Yisrael. Once you firmly believe these things, these two conceptual principles.
What do those terms mean?
Achdus Yisrael is a Jewish unity, and Avas Yisrael is love for other Jews. The Lubavitcher Rebbe said that the reason that there's a conceptual primacy of Achdus Yisrael over Avas Yisrael, meaning why should I love another Jew? Because deep down, me and the other Jew are the same entity. We're all slices, manifestations, expressions of God. And if this is a classic Chabad notion that you have to understand something to be able to feel it and act upon it, that if you firmly believe that and you think that and you learn the Torah about that and it becomes part of who you are, that is going to generate the emotion of Avas Yisrael, of loving other Jews. So that the notion of Avas Yisrael, of loving other Jews, in its most primal form, is just because of the identity of the other Jew, irrespective of any behaviors, irrespective of any types of activities or choices that they're making. In fact, in one sikha, in one talk, the Lubavitcher Rebbe even says, if that's the case, if you're loving another Jew because of the essential nature of their identity and their relationship with God, their relationship with you, why does Aaron HaKohen, if he's Ohev Tzivrios and Makarv in the Torah, why does he have to bring people close to Torah? Why is that part of the equation?
Just translate that for me, Yosef.
The Mishnah Pirkei Avos states that Aaron HaKohen, he would love Jews, and he would love Jews, and he would bring them close to Torah. So if we're understanding loving Jews is because of this essential identity of the other Jew, so then why do we need a second half of the Mishnah? Why should you even bring them close to Torah? They're essentially amazing, even as they are. So the Lubavitcher Rebbe says, no, that's exactly the point. Once you have the foundation of that you firmly believe that the person you're speaking to is an expression of divinity on this world, and they are one with you, so then you also know that the Torah is the best way for a Jew to live. Of course, you want them to express their neshama through the Torah. But the love you have for them is not dependent on the kiruv. It's not dependent on getting them to do mitzvos. The love you have for them is based on their essential identity as a Jew, as somebody that is a expression of divinity in this world, and as somebody who is essentially one with you. And
that is the point, meaning it is the unconditional love that is in reaction to the unchosen Jewish identity. It's always been ironic for me that the chosenness of the Jewish people is an unchosen part of our identity. It's especially in Hasidic thought, it is unearned, so to speak. It is inherent, and that's detached from the expectations that fall from it. It is a love that has to be inherent and unconditional, and from that, everything else follows.
Exactly. And if you really love them, you want what's best for them, and you also firmly believe that Torah and mitzvos is the best lifestyle for a Jewish neshama to express itself in this world.
So let me just ask you, I have two follow-up questions about that. So why, there's something very essentialist. Reb Tzadok is similar in this way. I don't really have a firm enough grasp about Rav Kook to comment, but the Lubavitcher Rebbe is extraordinarily essentialist in the difference between Jews and non-Jews. I mean, it is not a very modern idea. It's an idea that may make some incredibly uncomfortable. I have two questions on this, and then I have a third question after you address this. But my question about this is, number one, did any of that make you uncomfortable in the way that the essentialist formulation of the Jewish people? And secondly, and maybe this has something to do with it, why did God create non-Jews then? Why not have just the Jewish people on earth? And why is there a point of having a non-Jewish community? It's always something that if you're a half-thinking person, there's a lot of gaslighting that can sometimes be involved theologically, the stories that we are raised with and that we try to keep a hold of in our later years. One of the hardest theological ideas to hold on to is the chosenness of the Jewish people. And there are different ways and different problems that emerge from it. But if you take a very essentialist view that there's this kind of inherent holiness, inherent connection to God that we have, to me, it raises the question of we are a tiny fraction of the 6 billion people on earth. There are people who have never met any Jews. Why not create everyone with this part of the soul, this chelek Elokah mimal, that has this inherent essentialist divinity inside, what is the purpose of the Jewish people? Or otherwise put, what is the purpose of non-Jewish people?
Well, that is a great question. For the people that want a fuller rendition, and I can do justice to now, it's chapter 16 in the book. That is between particularism and universalism, the role of non-Jews in the Dira B'Tachtonim.
Dira B'Tachtonim, again, that's a term that the Rebbe uses over and over. That's the lower dwelling, the dwelling in the place that's most different, being the most supreme expression of divinity.
Right. Yeah, God essentially wants to dwell. God's initial and most natural home is in the places that seem the farthest from him, to some degree. And that's a term which comes from the Midrash, comes from Tanya, but that's a term that the Rebbe used a lot. So I guess it started like this. The Rebbe paraphrased a statement from the Kuzari, who asked basically this exact question of why did God create non-Jews, and why did God create Jews different? I forget the exact formulation in the Kuzari. And the Chacham in the Kuzari, the wise Jew in the Kuzari, which is a work of medieval Jewish philosophy, which is constructed as a debate between a pagan king and a Jewish Talmud Chacham, a Jewish scholar. The Jewish scholar basically says we don't fully understand why God does things. Maybe why is there a difference between vegetation and animals? Why is there a difference between minerals and vegetation? We recognize the fact that there are complexities, there are different levels of sophistication, there are different layers of reality. So once you're willing to grant God the ability to do that, so God also created different levels of humanity. There is, obviously, from a taxonomical perspective and from a biological perspective, Jews and non-Jews are essentially alike. But in terms of spiritual fabric, there are going to be differences. So in terms of why God did that, we don't really know. But we do have some analogies or some metaphors that the Kuzari already employs and the Rebbe amplified to describe this. If the Kuzari and the Rebbe quotes this, Kuzari describes the heart as one of the most essential organs, but you can't just have a heart without limbs, without hands and feet. Presumably, the heart is more essential than the hands and the feet, but we understand the human being, a complete human being, there's not just a heart and a head and a brain, it is also includes hands, feet, and noses and ears. From a similar perspective, all of humanity is like one person, one body. The Jewish people are the heart, and the non-Jews, who have some role to play, are analogized to the different limbs of the body. That's in terms of why God created Jews and non-Jews. We don't really know, but we understand based on other aspects of reality, which are easier for us to grasp, that this is the way God creates things. One of the fascinating things about the Lubavitcher Rebbe is that usually in Kabbalistic circles, maybe not usually, but often in Kabbalistic circles, where this essential difference between Jews and non-Jews is highlighted and amplified and accentuated, there is often Jews are amazing and non-Jews are horrible. Non-Jews come from the klipos, from the negative forces of reality. Non-Jews are almost subhuman to a degree if you read certain sources. They are filled with demonic forces. And depending which Kabbalist you're reading, some think they are redeemable, some think they're less than redeemable, but you do have this major bifurcation between Jews and non-Jews. One of the fascinating things about the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and this, again, you already see this a little bit in the earlier writings of Chabad, but the Rebbe leans heavily on the Rambam for this perspective, is that every single person in this world is essential. That the Rebbe says that Jews have a special yechida, a special pintalayid, a special deep essential connection to God, but every human being has an essential connection to God. He calls it's me'ain. It's similar to, analogous to the connection a Jew has with God, but it is also a deep connection with God, which animals don't share, which vegetation doesn't share. The Rambam's perspective on the messianic time period and redemption is where the entire world is going to be filled with its desire to come close and understand and live by God's will. And this is something which the Rebbe emphasized time and time again, that if you are a Jewish person and you believe in the Torah and you believe that we're getting close to Mashiach, history is marching forward, then you have to believe that Jews have a responsibility to the entire world in order to bring the light of ethical monotheism, Shev Mitzvos B'Noach, the 7 Noahide laws, which aren't just seven individual lines in a book, but there are 7 ethical principles by which a non-Jewish person could really aspire to live a life that is close to God. And the Rebbe he worked very hard with the sources to expand the religious and spiritual horizons for non-Jews to sort of bridge that gap practically as much as possible, while still never fully breaching the gap between Jews and non-Jews.
Let me turn to a question that is related to this topic, and that is the question of the term. I'm going to use a fancy word that scholars use, but antinomianism. Antinomianism means, the abrogation. That's another fancy word. So not ascribing to the law, being, subverting the law. In a world such as the Lubavitcher Rebbe, where everybody has this inherent connection and the world is an expression of God, it is very easy, I could imagine, to kind of, look at the world and say, well, most of the world is not doing Torah and mitzvos. Most of the world is not involved in these things and doesn't really have a lot of time to commit in the way that halacha might want them to. And there could even be a danger in the way that we highlight that inherent connection that a Jew could have, because as opposed to when you grow up in the Yeshiva University based Midrash, it's very hierarchical in terms of what we praise and what we put on a pillar. You were praised because you were very bright, you were very accomplished in Torah learning, you had refined character, and you got into what is known as the Kollel Elyon, which is the top kollel for the best learners. And that gave you kind of a certain aura in a base medrash world, that almost an air of superiority. It is very elitist in the modern Orthodox world and in the yeshiva world, and the elitism serves a purpose, because that way other people they're not as far. They need to put in more effort to get there, and it is a clear hierarchy of values that we are trying to aspire to. Our teachers are on the highest pedestal, and there are the people underneath, and the Yosef Bronsteins of the world. And then, there are the people who are struggling, they're trying hard, and the bums, and the people who don't even know it. But there is a hierarchical and there is an elitism that is associated both with Yeshiva University, with the yeshiva world. I think the Orthodox community in general needs an elitism in order to survive, because otherwise, why put in the effort? Why try so hard? Why work so hard? Why try to get up for Daf Yomi? Why do any of this if it is not, if I am not seen to be better than or a superior way of living? The Lubavitcher Rebbe obviously holds to the superiority of Torah and mitzvos, but does collapse a lot of the hierarchy, the theological hierarchy. So how does the Lubavitcher Rebbe avoid, after collapsing that hierarchy by everyone having that inherent connection, how does the Lubavitcher Rebbe still hold on to the importance of putting in the effort if you already have this inherent connection?
Wow, that is a great question, a very perceptive question. If you go through the second section of the book, which is about more of the abstract theological principles of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, you'll see a pattern that the Lubavitcher Rebbe was very much aware of the fact that if God permeates everything and everything is included in the one substance of God, so there is a certain collapsing of the hierarchies. And you will find this. You will find that the Lubavitcher Rebbe's his interpretation of the Mishkan, to a degree, is that the whole purpose of the Mishkan is the tabernacle, is that you have the temple, the Beis HaMikdash, is that the inherent sanctity of these spaces is supposed to spill over and sanctify the wilderness, the wilderness around it. And you have a breaking of certain binaries, and you have a certain flattening of hierarchies. But at a certain point, the Lubavitcher Rebbe says, in a way that we don't fully understand, but in a way that God could do, despite the fact that everything in this world is an expression of divinity in one way, shape, or form, there are certain aspects of this world, or certain behaviors, certain actions, certain ideas, which are more essential expressions of the deepest essence of God. Again, the Lubavitcher Rebbe has the theological terminology, the mystical terminology to describe this. So even though, let's say, Ach Esav Yaakov, the pasuk says that Esav is a brother to Jacob. Esav, the two brothers, they're equal. And the Lubavitcher Rebbe has a paragraph explaining how, on a certain level, there are no differences between Yaakov and Esav, because everything in this world is an expression of God. But still, nonetheless, as Yaakov and Yahiv, or I'm forgetting the end of the pasuk, God says, nonetheless, despite that, in spite of the fact that makes sense from a certain perspective, because everything is an essential expression of divinity, still, I love Yaakov. And the same thing happens with Torah mitzvos. There is a Midrash, which the Lubavitch Rebbe quotes several times, that God says, I don't know which is better, the actions of tzaddikim or the actions of Rashayim. And yet, I choose the actions of tzaddikim. So the Lubavitch Rebbe's interpretation of this is that, yes, on a certain level, it wouldn't make sense to say there's no difference between good and bad, there's no difference between the actions of tzaddikim and the actions of Rashayim, between saying Kriya Shema,
the righteous and the
righteous.
I know how to translate Rashayim in this context, but people who are not following the halachic commands are not following law in the way they're supposed to.
Exactly. That from a certain perspective, there shouldn't be a difference, and yet, despite that, God says, I choose the actions of tzaddikim, of the righteous. I choose a life of Torah mitzvos. So what I think this does for the Lubavitch Rebbe and for the followers of the Lubavitch Rebbe is, and on the one hand, you have one level of the philosophy which expresses a basic appreciation of everything in this world. Everything in this world is an expression of divinity. Esav is an expression of divinity. The actions of Rashayim, in some way, shape, or form, it might be an expression of divinity. Things that are mundane, the desk that my computer is on now, is an expression of divinity. And yet, even though you have this in the back of your mind, and that influences you in the way you interact with people, the way you think about people, everything is significant. Everything has a place in God's world. Nonetheless, there are certain people, lifestyles, actions, ideas that are more fundamental, more primal expressions of divinity in this world, and that's ultimately what God chooses. So what I think this does for you is, again, think about the Lubavitch Chassid, your follower of the Lubavitch Rebbe, interacting with a non-Jew or a Jew that is not following Torah mitzvos. You have the basic level of, you're amazing, your expression of divinity, this is great, but you also have the final formulation, but there is a right way and a less than right way to live in this world.
That is really fascinating, because I've always seen a real difference, I mean, not just programmatically, between Chabad, the Kiruv world, and Yeshiva University. I look at these different shades, all within the Orthodox community, to be deeply rooted in theology and philosophy. I think that the contrast between halachic man, the work of Rabbi Soloveitchik, and the way that halacha and halachic observance kind of colors the Yeshiva University experience versus the more mystically rooted philosophy of the Lubavitcher Rebbe creates a very different type of hierarchy, different type of priorities that we have communally. I want to shift, because time is flying quickly, and hopefully you'll have a little bit more time to talk, because this last topic is really the most important, and that is shifting to the messianism of the Rebbe. And before we get to that, I wanted to kind of start. You went to South Shore. You went to Yeshiva University. We kind of had a both similar, more or less centrist, modern Orthodox upbringing. What was your relationship with Mashiach prior, let's say growing up? Is this something that was front and center for you? Is it something that you thought about in a serious way? Did you feel like your knowledge of messianism coming out of yeshiva was something that was sophisticated and serious?
So I think the answer is no, but I think it's by design.
Yes.
Meaning, I think, if I recall correctly, I think it's Rav Moshe Sternbach, who was one of the leaders of the Ida Charidis here in Eretz Israel. I guess we would call it the ultra Orthodox. He has a quote from one of his teachers, the Brisker Rav, that there is no obligation to bring Mashiach. Your obligation is to learn Torah, to do mitzvos, to live life as God wants you to live life, and it's up to God to bring Mashiach when God wants to bring Mashiach. And therefore, Mashiach is always something you hope for. It's a time when all wrongs are going to be righted, when people are not going to be sick anymore. But it's not something which you're actively, I guess you would say, trying to create every time you learn Torah and do mitzvahs. That is something which shifts once you enter the more mystical world in general and the world of Chabad in particular.
Did that shift for you? Did you find it uncomfortable, or you found it comforting?
I would say on two levels. That in a general shift towards thinking about things that I'm doing as trying to bring Mashiach, Forget about the person Mashiach, about the messianic reality, a redemptive utopian time period that's described by our prophets, described by the Rambam very beautifully. That shift I had already made when I entered the thought of Rav Kook, because this is also front and center for Rav Kook, this type of historical consciousness. In Chabad, it's amplified. In Chabad, it's imminent. It's not something which, at the end of a process, Mashiach is going to come, and we have to move the ball along. But Mashiach could come tomorrow, and it could be your mitzvah that is going to bring Mashiach. And therefore, every second of every day, you are faced with a choice. Could I do something that is potentially going to push the world over the line to be a redeemed reality where people are not going to be hurt anymore, wars are going to finish, there are not going to be any more hostages or soldiers who are being killed, or not? And that creates a certain perspective, a certain texture of the Torah mitzvos that you're living.
So tell me a little bit about the Rebbe's philosophy of Mashiach. I know this is a very big topic, and there are some more sensational questions which I'll probably ask you because will be on everybody's mind. But let's start with, what is the role of Mashiach? I went to South Shore. Did you have Rabbi Newman in South Shore?
I did, yes.
So Rabbi Newman was the dean of students. He wasn't the head of school or the principal. That was Rabbi Hertzberg. But Rabbi Newman was a Chabad chassid. I'm not sure whether or not he's still alive. He would probably be in his 90s already. And he would offer, I was in school, I think you're maybe 2 grades younger than me, but I was in school, when the Lubavitcher Rebbe was both sick and when he passed away. He was getting sick already when I was in 2nd grade, 3rd grade, and he passed away when I was in 4th grade. And I remember Rabbi Newman would give us jelly beans, and he would have us make a bracha on the jelly beans, and the bracha, he would say, was to bring Mashiach. That was my introduction to Mashiach. But what exactly I was bringing in my mind was very childish. It was, an old man on a donkey. It was, it looked like Elio Hanavi. It looked like a person who was going to come down the street and announced something. It was very exciting. And growing up in the early 90s during the, with Saddam Hussein and the Iraq War and Scud Miss, it felt very messianic. He could be coming at any second. And what it meant coming in my mind was it was very person-centric. Messianism was inextricable from Mashiach. There was no concept called a Mashiach consciousness or mindset. It was a person who was Mashiach, and he's going to be in charge. He's going to run the world. To me, and you could correct me, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, I think, formulates an idea of Mashiach that is far more sophisticated and has a lot more depth to it than I think my 2nd and 3rd grade perception, which unfortunately I think most people in our community, by design, stick with that conception because you don't want to think too much about Mashiach, because then you do things that might be, crazy. You might get false messiahs or all this other stuff. So start from the beginning in your mind of where does the Rebbe anchor the idea and the importance of Mashiach?
So the Lubavitcher Rebbe, he's drawing from all the traditional rabbinic sources about the time period of Mashiach. Just on that note, on that point, the Lubavitcher Rebbe has a letter or a small note that he wrote towards the end of his life, where he says there is no obligation to search for the person Mashiach, but there is an obligation to try to bring the messianic reality, the redeemed reality. So you see that distinction very, very clearly there. The Lubavitcher Rebbe is working with 2 sets of sources. He's working with Nigla and he's working with Nistar. He's working with the revealed Torah, with the Psukim, with the Rambam, with the halachic sources, and he's working with Nistar. He's working with the more Kabbalistic, Hasidic, mystical sources. And he saw these 2 descriptions of Mashiach, of the messianic time period, as aligning in a very, very beautiful, harmonious way. How does the Rambam describe Mashiach based on the Psukim and based on rabbinic statements? It's a time period when there is no war. It's a time period when there's world peace. It's a time period when there's material bounty. And it's a time period where there's no more kinah or tacharum. There's no more competition. There's no more jealousy amongst people. What are people going to be doing? People are going to be living a life of Torah, Jews and non-Jews to some degree, and trying to figure out God, trying to understand God, engage with God, experience God to the nth degree. And that's the way the Rambam seems to describe the messianic reality in the last 2 chapters of his book, Mishneh Torah.
Let me just ask you, because I've been asking this question a lot. In his conception of the messianic age, are there still going to be atheists? Are there still going to be people who miss Shacharis in the morning? Can you go off the derech? Can you stop being religious in the time of Mashiach, in the worldview of the Rebbe?
Of the Rebbe or the Rambam?
The Rebbe.
The Rebbe. So I think the answer is going to be no, because the Rebbe aligned this perspective of the Rambam with what Tanya and Kabbalistic sources describe, which is that as I mentioned earlier, in the Kabbalistic worldview, in the Hasidic worldview, everything in this world is a manifestation of divinity. But that's not the way we experience the world. We experience the world as concealing God. You don't see God in this world. You don't see God in the computer, in the desk, in the other person. Everything in this world conceals its true nature. It conceals its true source. The Hebrew word for olam, for world, is olam, and that shorish, ayin lamed mem, also means hidden. So God hides himself in this world. The messianic reality, the redemptive time period, is a time period when God is no longer hidden. When you will look at the tree, and that tree will be transparent to its source, which is God. The tree will still exist. The tree will still be a tree with the bark brown and green. But when you look at the tree, when you touch that tree, you will be experiencing God. Think about the most amazing prayer service you ever had, the most transcendent spiritual moment you ever had. That will be the way you walk around the world when you just bump into a tree, bump into a friend. When you sit down in a chair, you will be constantly enveloped in this sea of godliness. In that type of reality, it's going to be very clear what God wants you as a person to do. It's going to be Torah and mitzvahs. So the clarity, I think, is going to negate the ability to choose otherwise. The Rebbe does quote the Ramban that says that when Mashiach comes in the redeemed state of reality, we're no longer going to have a choice to choose to do averus, to sin, because the true nature of reality is going to be so clear that it's just going to be painfully obvious to everybody that this is the way you're supposed to do things. And so part of what the Rebbe was trying to do with his push towards messianism, again, there are historical reasons why the Rebbe thought Mashiach was coming very, very soon, and why we're living in a time period of Ikvasat to Mashiach, of the heels and the heels of the Mashiach. They're getting closer and closer to the messianic reality. But what the Rebbe wanted people to do was to start seeing this world, start living in this world, even when God is still hidden. Even then, when you look at the tree, you don't see God. But you have to train yourself to look at the tree through a messianic lens. So look at a person through a messianic lens. And throughout history, people did this successfully, not successfully. Maybe the great masters of Kabbalah did this. Maybe certain righteous people did this. But as we get closer to Mashiach, it's our responsibility to look at the light beyond the tunnel, which is there shining very clearly, we're almost there, and use it and take that from the back of our minds to more towards the front of our minds, try to live life, look at the world, look at people through these messianic lens. And it's through this messianic consciousness and living a life of this messianic consciousness and feeling a life of this messianic consciousness that actually helps create the ultimate messianic reality. And then eventually, once everybody in the world is thinking this way and lives life this way, then Hashem will send that person who's going to be coming on a donkey, coming on a cloud, no matter what it is, that doesn't matter at that point, who is going to be the leader who's going to rebuild the Beis HaMikdash. So it starts from the bottom up. It starts with training ourselves to live messianically, and that triggers, or that causes, so to speak, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God, to finish off the story, to finally rebuild the Beis HaMikdash.
You quote, there is another book, I don't have an interview with him set up, but I found it extraordinarily fascinating. It's a book by an academic mystic, somebody who I think is very engaged in mysticism, named Elliot Wolfson, and he wrote a book called Open Secret. And the basic assumption of the book in many ways is that the Rebbe was de-emphasizing the person of Mashiach and essentially saying that is almost an afterthought, and the messianic time period can be in this moment once you are willing to fully embrace this messianic consciousness on an individual level. Now, I'm obviously not doing all that much justice to him, and I'm not asking you to comment even on Elliot Wolfson's thesis, though you're more than welcome to. It's a very hard book to get through. But I want to focus on the last two parts that you said, which is that once the world has this messianic consciousness, then God will send the person and rebuild the third temple. Is the Rebbe's view of that person and the rebuilding of the third temple the same as the Rambam? It's the same, you said maybe it's on a donkey, maybe it's on a cloud, and we'll rebuild the temple and we'll have, sacrifices and reinstitute animal sacrifices. We'll have karbanos as usual, which is something that Rav Kook spoke and even was willing to imagine maybe that's not the end game. Was the Lubavitcher Rebbe's end game in terms of the person of Mashiach and the rebuilding of the third temple totally traditionally in line with the Rambam's view on this?
I think 100%. I think I don't want to comment on Elliot Wolfson's thesis, Professor Elliot Wolfson's thesis right now. He actually had a follow-up. There's a YouTube video where you watched it, revisited some of the elements of that thesis. The Rebbe quotes the last two chapters of the Rambam hundreds and hundreds of times, which would describe the messianic time period, the nature of King Mashiach, what's going to happen. He actually, if you ask the Lubavitcher Rebbe in one sentence, what defines the messianic time period according to the Rambam, he would say, at least he says in several of his talks, maybe he has other definitions elsewhere, it is the complete restoration of the Torah and the system of mitzvahs. But you have to understand what is the nature of Torah and the system of mitzvahs to understand the significance of that. But the basic, revealed Torah type of definition of the Messianic time period is the complete restoration and fulfillment of Torah mitzvahs. I have no reason to believe that the Rebbe did not believe in the person Mashiach as being an essential or one of the essential components of this Messianic time period. I think what he was doing was saying that it's not just that you do a mitzvah and then Mashiach comes. It's that if you understand what a mitzvah is and you live life with his messianic consciousness and you infuse that into your mitzvahs, so then you're living in a personal messianic reality, but that doesn't mean the world is redeemed yet. The world is redeemed when everybody is living in that way, and you need a leader. The Rebbe was very into this. You need to have a single leader for the generation who's going to bring everybody together, unify mankind, to be able to serve God properly.
One thing, we are both graduates. I did my master's, you did your master's and your PhD, I believe, at the Revel Graduate School. And when I was there, at least when I started, he's no longer the dean, but the dean when I began, and I had a very warm relationship with him, wrote an excellent paper, was somebody named David Berger, Dean David Berger, right? And I had a very warm, wonderful relationship with him and spoke with him, but he wrote a book that was quite controversial in the world of Chabad, which is called the Rebbe, Chabad, and the Scandal of Orthodox Indifference, where he sounded an alarm about Chabad messianism based on his previous scholarship as a Christian scholar. He's a frum observant Jew, but he was very concerned that this could lead towards, so to speak, another movement or another religion paralleling the messianism surrounding Jesus. I am curious, after reading this book, I have two questions. Do you find Dean Berger's, Dr. Berger's concerns more relevant, less relevant, more on the mark, less on the mark? And do you think the Rebbe thought of himself as the Mashiach?
Oh, wow. So first to preface my remarks, Dean Berger was the dean of Revel throughout my entire tenure there, from the beginning of my master's to the end of my PhD. He sat on my defense committee. He was always the pole star of both an amazing scholar and also a mensch. And yes. I am very, very, very indebted to Dr. Berger for many things. I told him when I started this project, I told him that I was starting this project. He gave me his blessing. But my project in this book doesn't really touch on his book. This book ends with the Rebbe's unfortunate stroke in 1992, because this book is about the Rebbe's Torah. It's about things the Rebbe said and how they fit together to create a complete philosophy. What Dr. Berger is doing in his book is describing the aftermath. He describes where the Chabad community was in the aftermath of the Rebbe's passing, 1994, 1995, 1996. I'm forgetting exactly when he published the book. And he happens to think that the majority of Chabad Hasidim, believe that the Rebbe said he was Mashiach. B, therefore believe that the Rebbe will come from the dead to be Mashiach. And C, that opinion, that Mashiach will come from the dead, is beyond normative Jewish thought, and therefore they are all heretics, and therefore you cannot trust their shchita, cannot drink their wine, etc., whatever the traditional laws about heretics are. So my book has, so I think it's less, the concern of Dr. Breuer is less about Jesus, or he mentions it from time to time. It's more about those points. The number one, sure. the majority of Chabad Hasidim think that the Rebbe said he was Mashiach. B, that continues even after the Rebbe passes away, and therefore Mashiach will come from the dead. And C, that belief is beyond normative Jewish beliefs. What I do in my book, so I think some of the Chabad responses were that A, the Rebbe never said he was Mashiach, and B, even if somebody happens to believe Mashiach comes from the dead, that is not beyond normative Jewish beliefs. There seem to be comments in the Rishonim that indicate that Mashiach could come from the dead. What the relevant part in my book the part of my book that's relevant for this entire picture is that the Rebbe did say certain things towards the end of his life, which some Chabad Hasidim interpreted to be that the Rebbe felt that he was going to be the Mashiach. Towards the end of his life, the Rebbe was speaking very cryptically. The sikhos were a little bit shorter. There were more. He referenced a lot without fully fleshing things out. And the messianic rhetoric definitely got more intense in terms of every single sikha, every single talk had to do with Mashiach's imminent arrival. And here and there, the Rebbe seemed to say something that was self-referential. Just to note, throughout the Rebbe's entire talks, he assiduously avoids speaking in first person. There are 70,000 pages, 11,000 hours of public talks from the Lubavitcher Rebbe. You can count on your fingers the number of times he speaks in first person. You can look in the book, and there are reasons for that in terms of the notion of bittul, the notion of the way the Rebbe viewed his role vis-a-vis
self-nullification.
Self-nullification. The Rebbe is not into self-aggrandizement at all. He does not speak in first person. Almost never.
Fascinating. Almost never says I.
Almost never says I. And this is particularly important because he does do intellectual and spiritual biographies of individual people, starting from Adam and Avram and Moshe, all the way down to the Rebbes of Chabad. He spends time focusing on their personalities, what they added to the historical narrative, what their special texture of their service of God was, how they moved the world forward. And all of that stops with his father-in-law, who was a sixth Rebbe of Chabad. And with him, it's always about the generation. This generation is the generation of X, Y, and Z. You could trace this in the talks. Sometimes he's even talking about the previous Rebbes of Chabad. When it gets to him, it's always about the generation. It shifts from a person to the generation. But here and there, towards the end of his life, there might be some references, or some people interpreted certain things he said to be self-referential comments or hints, allusions that he was going to become the Mashiach. What I do in the book is that I try not to take a stand on it. And in the last two chapters, which are about A, did the Rebbe see the world as being redeemed already? And B, did the Rebbe see himself as being, or potentially being, the Mashiach? What I do is that I go through what I feel like are the major statements the Rebbe said that are part of this discussion, and I describe how the different groups in Chabad interpret it. I call there is a literalist group and a non-literalist group. There is a group that the Rebbe says something about himself and Mashiach. Clearly he meant he was Mashiach. And then there is the group that says, no, you have to understand the way a Rebbe talks, the way the Rebbe spoke for 40 years. There are a lot of literary tools, a lot of rhetorical tools, a lot of midrashic tools the Rebbe integrates into the way he spoke. And if you interpret this line as one line out of a whole sikha, out of context in a literal way, you are misunderstanding what the Rebbe was doing. So that's what I do in the last two chapters of the book. I try to pick out the main talks and the main lines that are part of this debate in Chabad about what the Rebbe said and what the Rebbe, that we know what the Rebbe said, in terms of what the Rebbe meant. And I present the two camps. Here is the literalist camp, here's the non-literalist camp, there's a messianist camp, here's a non-messianist camp. And then Shalom Al Yisrael, it's not up to me to decide what the Lubavitcher Rebbe actually meant. I make a suggestion.
Yeah, do you have an opinion of which reading you find more compelling?
So I don't want to spill all the beans at the end of the book, but in just the last, I think what's much more important is what the Rebbe said and how leading Chabad Hasidim that have been with the Rebbe for decades, interpreted it. I think that should be foregrounded. Literally, the last 2 pages of the book, I make an interpretive suggestion, which is, I don't think it's a watershed. It's mostly that the Rebbe never definitively said he was Mashiach. That I think is clear. He never publicly clearly said he was Mashiach, but I suggested that he did feel like he had the potential to be, or that if Mashiach would come, he would probably be the person. The possibility was percolating in his mind, and that could account for some of the statements he made in that direction. But the bulk of the last 2 chapters really is these statements that became the source of the debate in Chabad about did the Rebbe say he was Mashiach or not say he was Mashiach, and how leading Chabad Hasidim, or really these 2 groups, interpreted these 2 statements, and with some of the methodological, I guess, tools with which the 2 groups approached these talks.
One thing that I've always struggled with is so much of the community's conception of Mashiach, and particularly the Rebbe's conception of Mashiach, is couched in the Rambam in these 2 chapters in the Hilchos Malachim, the Laws of Kings, and so much of our conception of how the end of days is going to come is based on this Rambam. The problem is, for me, is that how do we know the Rambam is correct? Because it doesn't go through the same kind of generational fine-tuning as all other aspects of halacha, where we have kind of the final word being paskind, or the final line by the Shulchan Aruch. So why do we anchor so much specifically in the vision or the articulation of the Rambam? How do we even know that the Rambam is in fact correct?
That is a great question. And it is actually, if I understand correctly, the source of one of the key debates between the Rebbe and Chabad, and on one hand, and religious Zionist philosophy on the other hand, about the stage of the messianic process that we're currently in. Was the Rebbe, as you said, was very, very focused on the Rambam as the posek, as a halachic decisive for what Yemos Mashiach is going to look like. There are various Midrashim, various rabbinic statements, there are various passages in the prophets about what Mashiach is going to look like, and the Rambam puts it all together in 2 nice chapters. The Rebbe felt that the fact, this is the Rebbe was quoting, I'm forgetting who he's quoting from earlier sources, that the fact that the Rambam was the only Rishon, the only person in the medieval time period, a time when halacha was being concretized and decided in terms of which opinions in the Talmud should be following. The Rambam was the only one who systematically ruled in every single area of Judaism, from the beginning to the end, from theology to Yemos Mashiach, with everything in between. And because the Rambam was the only one who systematically ruled about issues of the Beis HaMikdash, of the sacrificial order, of ritual purity and impurity, he treated them exactly the same way as he treated halachos that are daily halachos for us, like kashrus and Shabbos and things of that sort. That gave the Rambam a certain special status as the posek for these halachos that we don't do today. The Rambam treated and ruled upon as if they were relevant today. And therefore, the Rebbe would say frequently that the fact that we have a Midrash that says X, Y, and Z doesn't matter per se in terms of the way we expect things to unfold, because the Rambam is the one who distilled the normative Jewish approach to these things. Rambam was systematic. He was a great authority. He was the only one who systematically ruled on these issues.
But the Rebbe clearly addresses, meaning he's addressing this point of why have I staked such a, my own approach, the Rebbe's approach in the Rambam. He kind of addresses that explicitly.
100%. And it comes up in a very interesting way. And the Rebbe had a great fascination, the Rambam was of great stature in his eyes, as opposed to most Orthodox communities where the emphasis is on Daf Yomi, learn 1 page of Talmud every day. The Rebbe initiated Rambam Yomi. Every Jew should learn a page or a chapter or 3 chapters to the Rambam every day. Because the Rambam, he says, A, is easier to understand, and B, he systematically goes through Judaism for you from the beginning, which is about belief in God, to the end, which is messianic time period. So you're getting the entire Torah in a clear and very distilled Hebrew. So the Rebbe thought that could be an amazing way to encompass, for the entirety of the Jewish people, to encompass the entire Torah. And the Rebbe was aware of the fact that there are Midrashim that describe things in a different order. For example, the Rambam describes that it's going to be King Mashiach who is Mekabed Nidchei Yisrael. who brings together Jews from all corners of the world and leads them back to the land of Israel. If anybody, and yet we don't have the person of Mashiach now, and therefore the Rebbe said it's clear that whatever is occurring in the land of Israel, state of Israel today, is not the halachic definition of kibbutz galios, of the returning of the exiles from the four corners of the world. If anybody has spent time in a religious Zionist community, they will know that it's almost taken for granted that kibbutz galios has already happened, or is already very, very well underway. That this kibbutz nidchei Yisrael, that the fact that Jews came from all over the world to Israel, they founded a state, even irrespective of founding a state, that is a fulfillment of the prophecies. And this is one of the things that religious Zionist thinkers point to when they say we are living in a time period of Askalta de Geula, the beginning of the messianic time period. Rishis Snikas Kulasenu, the flowering of our redemption has already started. The Rebbe said, no, we're not living in Askalta de Geula. We're not living at the beginning of redemption. We don't have King Mashiach yet. We are living at the end of Galus. So it's a nuanced difference. Are you living at the last moments of Galus or the beginning of Geula? But there are several very key important differences, particularly about Zionism, that flow from this foundational point. And the Rebbe was very clear. We followed the Rambam. The Rambam says Mashiach is going to be the one who ingathers exiles. Mashiach hasn't come yet, and therefore the ingathering of exiles hasn't yet occurred. There's religious Zionists say, no, look at the Midrash. The Midrash to describe Mashiach coming at the end of the process. The Midrash to describe the Beis HaMikdash being built before Mashiach reveals himself, before Mashiach is revealed. And these Midrashim are very popular to be quoted in religious Zionist circles, but the Rebbe was very focused on the Rambam.
A lot of the final touches of this book came post October 7th, and you were writing a book about the philosophy of the Rebbe for the future of the Jewish people that obviously has a very redemptive, very messianic undertone. What was it like for you personally, living in Israel, watching everything that's been happening post October 7th, and having a part of your, the last leg of your responsibility in sharing the Torah of the Rebbe?
Wow. So that is a very, very, very meaningful question, because living in Israel and living as part of the religious Zionist community, everything, really, literally everything, is permeated by the war that's going on. There are people, I have neighbors who've been injured, neighbors who unfortunately have been killed. It's something that, even though I personally did not serve in the army, made Aliyah to too late of a stage. It's everything that's going on. People are thinking about the soldiers, about the hostages, about the whole situation here, and it certainly tempered a lot of the joy that I expected to feel when the book was finally done. But the way I think about it, the way I like to think about it, is that the world, very dark things are happening. There's a lot that's going on that should not be going on. A lot that is wrong with the world now. Any little bit of light, any little bit of bringing the world a little bit closer, or helping people come a little bit closer to Hashem, to the way things should be, to that utopian vision that the Rebbe was constantly describing and he mesmerized his followers with, any little bit is a positive move in the right direction. Is this book going to win the war for us? No. Is this book going to make a major impact in the military feats? No. We still have to daven. We still have to do Rosh Hashanah. People are still fighting. But everything positive that we do now should be put in this perspective that the world is a dark place. There are things that are happening that should not be happening. And any little bit of light, any little bit of correctness, any little bit of Torah and mitzvot, any little bit of the light of Mashiach that we could bring into the world right now is something that could eventually help move things in the right direction. So the simcha of finishing a book like this is tempered. It's not fully there, but hopefully the book on its own level could have an impact, inspire people to live more messianically, to live with that Mashiach consciousness, and hopefully that could help bring the actual Mashiach.
I could talk to you all day. Aside from the fact that I consider myself a very close friend, I find your approach to be so thoughtful, sensitive, and substantive. But I wanted to ask something. You keep on mentioning that you had a lot of guidance from the generation or people who spent a great deal of time on the Rebbe's Torah. You, as far as I know, I'm looking at an image of you right now. You haven't changed your yarmulke. You haven't grown a long beard. As far as I know, you do not identify as a Chabad Chassid. And you do not, you still identify as, a modern Orthodox Jew. I think a great modern Orthodox Jew. As far as I know, that affiliation hasn't changed. I'm curious if you think there were any advantages to being an outsider in approaching the Rebbe's Torah, and if there were ever moments where you felt at odds in your interpretation, in the way that you processed the Torah of the Rebbe, that highlighted differences the way an insider and an outsider would present their Torah, like disagreements, that you saw things differently as an outsider than somebody who grew up within that world?
Right, that's a great question. I'll respond to the first part first. I think the advantage of being an outsider for me was twofold. Number one is that you have other models to compare it to. So in every chapter, I try to go through a little bit of the intellectual history, and you go, what do Chazal say about the topic? What does Rambam say about the topic? What does Ramban say about the topic? Or the Hasidus? And then you sort of see where the Rebbe's chidush, where his innovation is, what he brings to the table in terms of integrating a lot of the earlier sources to create a new formulation at the end of the day. And I think, and also comparing the Rebbe to Rav Kook, to Rav Soloveitchik, to Rav Shach, you sort of, I think it's for me at least, it helped me situate what was the chidush, what was the innovation of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Where somebody is an insider, this is what they're taught, this is the truth, then they don't necessarily have, or it's much harder, I would say, to develop those sensitivities as to where to situate the Rebbe in the breadth of Jewish thought. That I think is one advantage. A second advantage, I don't know if this is true for every outsider, but for me, coming from a more academic background, is that I was thinking about, I was trained to think about things in terms of systems. So Rav Rosenzweig, my Rebbe, you referenced him before, he always organizes shiurim around a conceptual idea and derivatives. Whenever I try to read a large swath of text, that's naturally the way I was trained to think. What are the key ideas and what are the derivatives of it? And therefore, I don't necessarily start the book with the shluchim or with the Rebbe, with something that the Rebbe is more well known for. You start the book with the concepts, with what are the foundational concepts the Rebbe has, and then you sort of develop and see how things flow from there. And then I think I was very, 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 very much indebted to my Rebbe of Rosenzweig, and to the general academic outlook as to how to write essays and books. That being said, I could not have done this book without insider help. The Rebbe's Torah is massive. It's probably the largest output of a single individual in the history of Judaism, just because...
Do you mean that?
I 70,000 pages of published material. They have not everything is published yet. Even they're still publishing some of the oral talks, some of the Torah's Menachem series. I can't think of anybody else that has 70,000 pages of published material, all primary sources. So the Torah itself is vast, and the Rebbe is constantly referencing earlier Chabad thought. And Chabad thought is hundreds of dense volumes, and these are volumes that are hard to read. It's not just Tanya. It's not just Tanya and the Kutei Torah. It's not just Tanya, Kutei Torah, and Torah. Or there is a whole library of dense Chabad volumes that the Rebbe is constantly in conversation with, and putting sources together and developing them more. So I needed insider help because I had my perspective on the way things should be in terms of what the key ideas were, what the key sichos were, how to structure chapters. But people that are very, very bright, super dedicated, and have been learning the Rebbe's Torah and Chabad Torah for their entire lives, they definitely bring a lot of perspective to the table in terms of earlier Chabad thought, in terms of Yosef, in Chabad we say this is a key sikha for this topic. I think it should be foregrounded because it expresses the idea very, very well. Yosef, you have all the right ideas in this chapter, but I think, or we think, that maybe it should be restructured because in our understanding of it, this idea, which you have at the bottom of the chapter, really is a primary expression of this concept, and therefore it should be earlier. And all of these things created a lot of synergetic conversations between myself and some Chabad Talmudic Chachamim. I'll mention their names: Rabbi Zalman Shmatkin, Rabbi David Olatorich, Rabbi Eli Rubin, who I think is a good friend of yours as well, and
yes,
Rabbi Levi
1840 guest.
Right, and Rabbi Levi Shmatkin. We conversed, communicated over email, over Zoom for hundreds and hundreds of hours. The final formulations are my own. I took full authority and full responsibility for this book. But without the insider help in terms of some of the nuances, in terms of some of the background, And just in terms of people that are really, really living and breathing this Torah from day one of their birth, it's something which I really could not have done without, and the book is much more accurate because of their input.
Rav Yosef, I cannot thank you enough. My final question, which is probably my most important, is, you described yourself as an academic. Someone who knows you well knows that is a very incomplete, borderline, a farcical description. I do not, nor have I ever, though I admire the quality and depth of your scholarship, I know very few people who know you well who would describe you first and foremost as an academic, because you have one of the most sensitive souls and you take matters of faith and theology extraordinarily seriously. It is not just a topic that you like to write about. It's not just a topic that you find intellectually stimulating. You grapple with the topics that you discuss and deal with in a very personal, deeply personal way, because you believe in God and you believe in Judaism in a very serious way, in a way that I have found in few others. And my final question is to describe in what ways, if at all, engagement with the Torah of the Rebbe has changed you, either as a Jew. I am particularly interested to hear how the writing of this book changed you as a Zionist. You are a religious Zionist. You are deeply involved in the state of Israel. The Rebbe, and I know you discussed this in your book, was not a typical, certainly would not call him an anti-Zionist, and certainly wouldn't even call him a non-Zionist, but adapted a very different approach to the religious significance of the state of Israel. I'm curious in what ways, if at all, I don't need you to comment on Zionism, but I want you to comment on you as a Eved Hashem, as somebody who is a servant of God, somebody who takes this stuff really seriously in a real way. How has your engagement with the Torah of the Rebbe changed your approach, your Jewish thought, and your relationship to Yiddishkeit?
Wow, that is a great question. It's really hard to pick out a single idea, because a lot of what I've been learning, a lot of what the Rebbe taught, I've been integrating in a variety of ways. But if you had to put me on a single foot and against the wall and identify one idea, I would say perhaps it's the idea of bittul, which again you translated as self-nullification. I think Chabad scholars like translating it as effacement, because bittul means that I am not here as an individual, autonomous human being. It's Yosef Bronstein who's interacting with different things in the world. I have my own agenda, my own desires, my own life, my own career, my own aspirations. Bittul forces you or challenges you to view yourself as part of a larger whole. That's not self-nullification in the sense that Yosef Bronstein doesn't exist. Yosef Bronstein exists. God created me in a certain way, with certain capabilities, with lack of capabilities in other areas, certain background, certain family life, certain opportunities, whatever it is. But my goal is not to do the best Yosef Bronstein could do. It's to express something that is larger than myself. And I am a unique conduit to express something that's larger than myself, but so are you. And so is everybody. So you're always thinking about things, not just in terms of yourself as an autonomous, egotistical human being, but in terms of something larger. What is a larger entity? There are different levels. It could be your family. It could be your yeshiva, your community. It could be Am Yisrael. It could be humanity. It could be, ultimately, it's God. But when you start thinking about yourself, not as I need to I need to self-actualize in the sense that Yosef Bronstein has certain talents, I really want to bring them out into the world, but God has a certain vision for the world, and He chose me to bring out a tiny little slice of that through giving me unique talents. Where Am Yisrael needs me to do certain things for the sake of Am Yisrael, or my family needs me to do certain things for the sake of the family. You start viewing yourself in relation to other entities, and not just as an autonomous human being. And that is a perspective that the Rebbe hammered in time and time again, both theoretically with basing this idea of bittul in earlier Makoros, and practically, what does it mean to live a life where you're not an autonomous individual human being? You are part of a collective. You are part of God. And I think if we don't have to look more farther than Chabad Hasidim, than Shluchim, than people that are so dedicated to Am Yisrael, so dedicated to the world, so dedicated to bringing out divinity in the world, that these are people with full personalities. Chabad Hasidim, they're full personalities. They're funny. They're. It's not like they're bland because they self-nullified, but they're living life as part of a higher purpose, part of a larger entity, and that is something which I think is very beautiful. And I think it's hard to engage the Rebbe Torah seriously without that rubbing off on you in at least some small way.
We are so grateful that someone of your caliber and your experience, and who knows, maybe it was for this purpose, to introduce the Rebbe's Torah and ideas to a new audience with new language, with a new perspective. I always wrap up my interviews, as you already know, with more rapid-fire questions that you've answered before, but we're going to come back. We'll do a little bit of a spin on it. My first question, obviously, aside from your own book, and you mentioned one other book, from a shliach in Australia, I believe. But could you recommend some of the books that you find most helpful to introducing the thought of the Rebbe and or Chabad more generally to a broad audience?
Wow, that is a great question. I think first and foremost, what I did myself is that I tried to read everything that I could get my hands on from Rav Yoel Khan. Rav Yoel Khan was the head choser of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. He was one of the main people responsible for...
He would review his lectures.
He would review the Rebbe. The Rebbe often spoke on Shabbos, and there are no recordings. Rav Yoel Khan was, if I understand correctly, I wasn't there. I know very little about what actually happens in Crown Heights. But Rav Yoel Khan was at the fore of a group of people that memorized as well as possible and wrote down and elucidated the Lubavitcher Rebbe's talks. He was known for as having a photographic memory. He knew Chabad Torah backwards and forwards. But together with that level of sophistication is also an extreme clarity, which is a combination which is hard for us to find. Somebody that knows the Torah ins and outs, nuances, but could really get to the core ideas, express them very clearly, and then give you several supporting sources. So
was any of his stuff translated?
I'm not sure, but he gave a lot of shiurim. A lot of it was written from the shiurim. He wrote articles. Anything from Rav Yoel Khan in Hebrew is going to be very, 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 very worthwhile to read.
Do you want to make an English recommendation?
As an English recommendation, in terms of the thought of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, I would say that book by Rafael Levin, which is free on Chabad.org, is also in Hebrew books. The theology, I think it's called The Theology of Rabbi Nachum Mendel Schneerson, which I think, again, for me, was very important of our understanding sort of the structure of the Lubavitcher Rebbe's thought. And reading Sichos and Mamorim, I was able to connect some of the dots.
My next question, I've asked you this before, I want to put a spin on it. I usually ask my guests if somebody gave you a great deal of money to go back and write a PhD on any topic of your choosing. You've answered that question before. I'm wondering if a PhD specifically related to either the Rebbe or Rav Kook, your two interests in what you've spoken about less. Do you think there's a specific area of either of their respective thoughts that still awaits a deeper treatment and study? And if so, what would that be?
Wow. I don't know if it needs a deeper treatment, but for me, a lot of what I'm lacking is a background in classic Kabbalistic literature. I never read Zohar beginning to end. I never read the writings of the Arizal beginning to end. And I feel that for Rav Kook and for the Lubavitcher Rebbe, if you want to really, really understand where they're coming from and how they're interpreting earlier sources and putting them together, you have to have a very strong background in classic Kabbalah and early Hasidus. And that is something which I feel like I'm lacking to a degree. I've read a little bit, but I rely a lot on other people. I rely a lot on secondary sources, on looking up a particular footnote in a particular line. But I don't know if I have the goal to say that I want to learn the Arizal or the Zohar beginning to end. But if I would do a further study of Rav Kook or the Lubavitcher Rebbe, for me personally, I feel like that would be that would be the angle to fill in some of the gaps in the intellectual history that I don't really fully have a grasp on right now. But there are people that are doing these things amazingly.
Yeah, and you've surprised us before. I don't think when we were, learning or schmoozing together in the corner of the YU base Midrash, we would have necessarily thought that you would become so connected to either of their Torah, so we really don't know what the future has, and maybe this will be your next project. Who exactly knows? I'm sure it will be amazing and important for the Jewish people. My final question, as always, I'm always curious about people's sleep schedules. What time do you go to sleep at night, and what time do you wake up in the morning?
I usually go to sleep around 11, and I try to be up by 5.
My dearest friend, Rabbi Dr. Yosef Bronstein, thank you so much for your time and for your friendship over all these years.
Rabbi David, thank you so much. I love these conversations, and I'm excited, a little bit scared to share them with the world.
There is something about the transformation of Yosef Bronstein that I have seen since I have known him that I think is almost should be paradigmatic for the way, as a wider community, we engage with our own Jewish story. I was so deeply moved when I asked him, why were you so drawn to the Torah of Rav Kook and the Torah of the Lubavitch? What did they offer you that you did not get from other thinkers? I mean, you were raised at the very highest. He was always very studious and what did they offer? You know, the first time we had him on, he was talking about the philosophy of Rav Kook, and now he's written this incredible book on the philosophy of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And he takes all of his Talmudic acumen and just regular yeshiva training and applies it to these philosophies. And my question that I asked him in this interview was like, what is it about their Torah that drew you so much that you weren't getting already? And I loved his answer. His answer was, they made me feel like I was part of a larger story, the story of the Jewish people, where this came from, how this evolved, why it was different in different time periods. And both the Lubavitcher Rebbe and Rav Kook, in different ways, engage with that fundamental, massive question: what is the story that we are a part of? And I think that what Yosef Bronstein has done that is so remarkable and so important is that the largeness of the story actually allows us in our own lives to appreciate the details of our life more deeply. There was an article that Yosef Bronstein wrote. I've quoted it before. I think it is the most important article that he has written. It is more important in my mind than his work on Rav Kook and the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And it was an article that he published on the Lair House, which was entitled Bittul Torah, or a Taste of the World to Come, Fathers and Young Children. And it was an article about how, as a community, do we look at fatherhood. And to me, this entire article is about trying to find divinity and trying to find holiness, not just in, the base Midrash, not just in the study halls, not just in synagogue, not just when you're doing mitzvos, but in the very familial life of centering the family as the holiest place of Jewish life, the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the Holy of Holies. And to me, that is a direct outgrowth of engaging in the philosophy of Rav Kook and the Lubavitcher Rebbe, because they share a story that is large enough to find that divinity and holiness, almost the apex of holiness, not necessarily just in your Torah study, just in your prayers, but actually in your relationship with your family, with your spouse, with your children. And he ends the article, and I always come back. I reread it almost every Father's Day. I try to reread it as often as I come. It ends with this very short, beautiful story. And I want to close with that story. He writes as follows in this article: earlier this year, I began taking my toddler with me on Friday night to shul. While for a period of time this arrangement worked surprisingly well, one week my son had trouble sitting still, and we had to leave shul in the middle of the service. This happened to me all the time. I always bring my son, and I have to promise him, the moment you want to leave, we can go. He gets antsy, and we go. So he continues, as we walked home together, or more accurately, I walked while he ran laps around me. I met Rav Judah Michel, a friend and mentor who is steeped in the teachings of Hasidism. He met him as he's walking back. Now, I remember sharing this with Rav Judah. The real question on this story is, I know why Rav Yosef Bronstein was not in shul and walking home with his kids. What was Rav Judah doing outside of shul? Somebody's got to call him to task and ask him for a full explanation. Maybe he was going to a later minyan. Probably going to a later minyan. But either way, he meets Rav Judah, and he writes, if I'm reconstructing our conversation correctly, he commented that it was a beautiful scene to see a father and child walking together on Friday night in the streets of the land of Israel. When I objected that my child had just made me leave shul early, he responded, "Do you think Olam Haba, the world to come, we will be sitting by yourself at a shtender learning Gemara? It's also playing on the floor with your young child. It is Shabbos now. You can experience Me'ein Olam Haba, a taste of the world to come." And to me, this story, this outlook, this philosophy is an outgrowth of engaging in your own Jewish story and reassessing and reprioritizing what is at the center of Jewish life. How do we continue this story of Judaism? Whether it's that large story that's told to you by Rav Kook or the Lubavitcher Rebbe or somebody else, I think in this moment in history, now is the time to really be engaging with the reality of what Judaism offers us, with the reality of the story that we are a part of, and maybe get a little bit of a taste of that Olam Haba, that Me'ein Olam Haba, a taste of the world to come. So thank you so much for listening. This episode was actually edited by our friend Rob. Dina is on summer vacation. Hope you're enjoying. It wouldn't be a Jewish podcast without a little bit of Jewish guilt. So if you enjoyed this episode or any of our episodes, please subscribe, rate, review, tell your friends about it. You can also donate at 1840.org/donate. It really helps us reach new listeners and continue putting out great content. You can also leave us a voicemail with feedback or questions that we may play in a future episode. That number is 516-519-3308. Or, of course, you can email us at info@1840.org. That's where you go to sign up for our weekly emails to get your 10% off coupon code on all Koren orders until August 31st. If you'd like to learn more about this topic or some of the other great ones we've covered in the past, be sure to check out 1840.org. That's the number 18, followed by the word 40, FORTY.org, where you can also find videos, articles, recommended readings, and weekly emails. Thank you so much for listening, and stay curious, my friends.
Show